So we've reached NATO's 73rd anniversary. It's 70 years since NATO was founded. Its original purpose was to counter the Soviet Union. So this was an ideological threat to democracy. So countries banded together to oppose the threat posed by the Soviet Union. What is NATO's purpose today now that the Soviet Union is dissolved?
Yeah, that's exactly right, Brendan. What we're seeing right now in Eastern Europe with Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine, it's raising different questions about the usefulness of NATO at this point and whether or not the mission has drifted and whether or not NATO may be doing, in fact, more harm than good. Let's dig into some details.
I'm Brendan Fallon.
And I'm Lee Smith.
And we're over the target. Lee, as you mentioned, the Russia-Ukraine conflict is a situation that's really brought this question to the fore. What is the purpose of NATO? People have questioned, has NATO played a role in prompting Vladimir Putin's invasion of Ukraine? Perhaps a fundamental question is to start looking at what were the circumstances of NATO's founding in the first place 73 years ago?
Yeah, profoundly important. 1949. We're coming out of World War II, and of course that war is in the Pacific theater as well as the Atlantic theater. Western Europe was torn apart by that war and by the Nazis in particular, the great concern of the Western powers, all coming out of that horrific human catastrophe of World War II. Now their concern was the Soviet Union, right? So this NATO was an agreement for collective security. Western European nations, as well as the two North American powers, Canada and of course the United States, pledged to collective security and promised to protect each other in the event of a Soviet attack. And remember what happened for decades, and it's still the case, that American forces are stationed in Germany because it was the belief, it was the fear that the Red Army would come across from Eastern Germany into Western Germany. And that's why thousands over the course of 8 decades now, this is why perhaps millions and millions of American forces have been stationed in Germany because of that, to prevent a land war in Europe. And in that respect, we have to admit that NATO was profoundly successful. And so that credit goes to our men and women serving in uniform, as well as insightful and determined American statesmen, diplomats and elected officials and policymakers. All credit goes to them for that, for preventing another catastrophe in Western Europe.
You've mentioned that NATO was effective, that it played a role in preventing a ground conflict over the period of the Cold War. We know that there was a major turning point for NATO with the collapse of the Soviet Union by the end of 1991. If we go back a little bit, NATO had some other major achievements before that. I believe that in terms of the Korean War, do you want to talk a little bit about that, Lee?
Yeah, sure. The original 12 NATO members were Western European and North American. But later, in the 1950s, other countries joined NATO. And in particular, I want to pay special attention to Turkey, because Turkey is a very powerful and important NATO member now with a real army that spends money on its military. And this is one of the reasons why the U.S.-Turkey alliance is so important, because Turkey fought in Korea alongside the United States. And this is a very important thing, tying these two countries together. It also proved that NATO was not just about, as you point out, not just about fighting or deterring Soviet aggression in Europe. It was also an instrument to be able to fight communist regimes the world over. And this is one of the reasons, this is the reason why NATO forces were active in the Korean War, fighting communist forces there as well, including Chinese forces.
And I think this points to not just its militaristic power to oppose a communist force, but also its soft power presence, because this left, like South Korea, it left the people of South Korea with a very positive impression of NATO, of the United States. So it expanded America's sphere of influence in that respect as well.
Absolutely. In a sense, NATO was the embodiment of an idea, right? How do democracies protect themselves against communism, against all forms of authoritarianism? Because remember, coming out of World War II, the most dangerous authoritarianism, totalitarianism there was Nazism, right? So the idea that the Western democracies the Western powers, defeat of the Nazis there. The conviction, the important conviction was being able to fight all forms of totalitarianism that threatened freedom around the world. So NATO was an embodiment of the idea of liberty, right? Not just in the United States, but the idea that liberty was an important thing. This was the ideological component. Certainly there were political components as well in terms of interests, right? In terms of what was important to Western Europe, what was important to the United States, what were the different spheres of influence that were important to the United States. And remember, this is a key fact. The United States is a bi-coastal power with interest on the Atlantic coast and in the Pacific coast. And so this is one reason why communist China has long been and correctly perceived as a threat to the United States and to Western democracies. It's not just Europe. Our issues are not just in Europe. Our issues are also in the Pacific theater.
Just looking at the NATO website, it was interesting to note that it says that the tempo and diversity of operations that NATO were involved in increased from the early 90s. And the early 90s is, of course, when the Soviet Union collapsed. So this is the time NATO's founding purpose, as we discussed, was to counter the threat of the Soviet Union. But when the Soviet Union collapsed, you'd think it would suffer some level of disorientation, questioning its purpose, its function. But according to its own material, this is when its operation tempo and diversity rose.
With the fall of the Berlin Wall, with the end of what people celebrated as the end of the Cold War, NATO then became more of a I guess a generous way to put it is more of a celebration of democracies, of transitional states. And so a lot of the NATO members that came on, these were countries that either were former Soviets or rather were controlled by the Soviet Union. Places like Hungary, places like Bulgaria, places like Poland, places like what was then Czechoslovakia, and now we know as two separate countries, both of which are in NATO, the Czech Republic and Slovakia. So it became a way to bring in all these other countries that had once been behind the Iron Curtain, and now is a celebration of democracy. What do we all share in common? We are Western-oriented democracies, and our big concern is authoritarianism. Our big concern is totalitarianism. And one of the issues, as I think we're starting to see now, is that ideological conflict became less and less clear over time. And one of the problems that posed is we talked about the drifting mission of NATO. I think a large part of this problem is I don't think the United States, I think after the Cold War, I think a lot of American policymakers sort of lost focus, especially regarding Moscow. What did they want from Moscow? Did they want Moscow to become a democracy? Did they want to get rid of Vladimir Putin? What is it that they wanted? And this is one of the things that we're seeing play out right now, right, with the Biden administration's fitful statements and quasi-support of Ukraine and attacks on Russia. What has the United States wanted from Moscow? And what is NATO's perception of Moscow? We certainly know what Vladimir Putin thinks about NATO.